Hello, everybody, and welcome to Tansy's Tips. I am Tansy, and our first video will be on saxophone history and feature Dr. Paul Cohen. Enjoy the
I'm Paul
video.
Cohen. I'm a concert saxophonist in the New York City area. Um, I've had a career as a classical saxophonist, which has allowed me to play with most of the orchestras and chamber groups in the New York City area, including New York Philharmonic, Metropolitan Opera, and American Symphony. I teach at a variety of schools, and currently my schools that I teach at are Manhattan School of Music in New York City, NYU in New York City, Columbia University, and Rutgers University in New Jersey. I found that, in fact, there was a tremendous amount of music for saxophone that nobody knew of and that nobody had played that was of the same kind that my colleagues and friends were playing. And that got me really interested to find this music, to find out why it was written, who played it, why we don't play it, and to find out more about the nature of our instrument that would encourage that music.
Could you just take us through kind of like a timeline of events of the saxophone and its general advancement from the very beginning?
The big revelation for me was the saxophone was designed, invented, conceived as an orchestral instrument, not as a band instrument, and not as a hodgepodge instrument, but it was really designed to be something for the orchestra. And the reason for that is fascinating. In the middle of the 19th century, orchestras were becoming larger and more colorful as composers, as they were entering the romantic age of writing, were starting to demand more resources from the orchestra. So they would be adding more strings, and they would be adding different string materials to the string instruments to get bolder sound. The percussion section was expanding. The brass section was expanding to have tubas and all kinds of bass instruments. And the woodwind section was also expanding. We were starting to use the E-flat clarinet, it's famous, and the Berlioz simply fantastic. Yeah, piccolos. We had English horns, and we had more bass clarinets. But what we didn't have was a low bass reed instrument that would complement the woodwinds as the brass were having, as even the strings were having, and even as the tonal resources of the percussion was expanding. The sax, as a genius instrument designer, as well as having his own instrument shop, did two stunning things. He redesigned the bass clarinet and made it to be a fully functional, terrific instrument, which then became immediately used on a regular basis by the orchestra. And that's a design that's still being used today. And he invented the saxophone. And because he was looking for a bass reed instrument, the first saxophone he invented was a bass saxophone, the bass saxophone in C. There are a few instances where saxophone was written to the orchestra, but it wasn't used because the musicians refused to be in the orchestra if the sax instruments were used. Or at one point in an exhibition, somebody kicked over a saxophone and it was made unusable for a demonstration. But there was a lot of difficulty in getting it used, even though the initial use of the saxophone in the orchestra. But then there was a complete revival of the instrumentation for the French military band. Now, military bands at the time in 19th century Europe had a very different function than they did that we think of them in today's bands. They were not so much ceremonial, but since there were bands all over the country in small towns and small outposts, these were one of the major cultural institutions of any community. They originally were constructed of instruments that were traditionally from the early part of the 1800s. And there was a big issue as to these didn't sound big or full, especially for their outdoor functions. Sachs came up with a design for a series of instruments that were re-instrument military bands. He was scoffed at, he was derided. They literally had a battle of the bands. And the battle of the bands took place in a big field in the Paris area, where they had two different ensembles, one of the original instrumentation and one of Sax's bands, play one right after the other, and the crowd judged who was who. Even at that band, there were some issues in getting all of Sax's instruments there. There was some vandalism that was done, some of the instruments. But nevertheless, with a smaller number of instruments, the Sax's band was head and shoulders, sonorously, much, much better than the original instrumentation. And from that battle of the bands, which Sax won, the government decreed a new instrumentation. And of course, that's the new band involved saxophones. And it was being played in a lot of ensembles, all wind groups, all over the country. And then some years later, it started to be affiliated with the Paris Conservatory as an affiliate, not as a major part of it, but that also gave the instrument a toehold. Adolf Sax was the first professor there. And so it was developing, and it was not in any danger of going out of fashion or being lost. It wasn't catching on fire, but it was still a steady role of the instrument being used and used and used. And then, of course, we have, even in America in the 1850s, we have some composers writing. William Henry Fry from Philadelphia wrote the Santa Claus Symphony with a great soprano saxophone part in the 1850s, or Haggard in the Wilderness, can't make up these titles, which had the tenor saxophone part. Once it was introduced into the United States by Henry Lefebvre, who came over, studied with sax, went to South Africa where he played saxophone and clarinet, came to this country and was hired to be the lead saxophonist for the Gilmore Band, which was a concert band, like the Sousa Band was before Sousa Band. This is a band that toured nationally and internationally and really introduced the saxophone to the entire population of the United States. And Lefebvre was the lead saxophonist and also a soloist. He played constant solos all over the time. And that really helped to introduce the instrument into this country and started taking off as a really viable musical instrument. First in concert bands, and then as small saxophone groups, then sometimes in a saxophone choir, of course, as a solo instrument. And then as it started dance music, started to be involved in theater music, then sometimes ragtime ensembles, groups, and then as vaudeville started to coalesce in the late 1800s, it became a really interesting part of the vaudeville bands and that kind of entertainment, playing light music, sometimes serious music, many transcriptions. And that continued to evolve in a combination of the vaudeville bands, the solo ensembles, the group ensembles, the many concert and community bands. Started to be a big rise in the popularity of the instrument. Classical composers started to use it here and there, and we have some really wonderful works from around the turn of the century. Charles Ives, Charles Leffler, all wrote orchestral works that use the saxophone. Chadwick, from American composer from the Northeast, used it in one of his orchestral works. And this is all right around 1900 or so. As popular music began to expand, saxophone was right there, and it became involved in all kinds of popular music in this field. When jazz was introduced in the late teens, early 20s, saxophone was not one of the first instruments to be a part of that. They had the more traditional instruments of clarinet, trumpet, trombone, drums, piano. But very soon after that, in the early 20s, the saxophone found a voice in jazz, and it became a tremendous voice, and then started to take over and become a real significant defining voice of jazz, in addition to its use in other.
Thank you so much for watching our first episode, and keep on the lookout for more, and have a great day.